My name's Shahina Johnson. I'm 57 years old and I was born in Watford in England. So my parents decided to come to England and they arrived in 1967, and that was a massive decision for them. They had three small children who were my two older sisters and brother, and I think I realised that they just about knew that they were expecting me at the time that they travelled, which must have been incredibly brave. And they were both teachers and they both loved education. They really believed in it. And my dad had also trained to be a lawyer and had been practicing in Pakistan for some time. And I think he became concerned, a little bit disillusioned maybe with the legal system there. And he really wanted the best future for his children he could possibly give them, like any parent would. And so they made the really big decision to come to England at a time when people from South Asia were being invited to come and build their lives in England. And that was a huge decision for them to make. And I'm so proud of them when I think about them travelling with a small family to come to a different country. So my parents came from different places in Pakistan. My mother was from Lahore, which is one of the big cities, and from quite a big family. There were 6 brothers and 6 sisters in her family, and her father was a headmaster and he was also a school inspector. And that's how he came across my father, because my father came from a small rural family, very different to my mother's family, but he was kind of taken under the wing of an uncle who wanted to support him in his education, and my dad was able to train to be a teacher and moved to Lahore. And it's really quite sweet how they met, because my grandfather, my mother's father, was doing a school inspection in one of the local secondary schools, and he was actually inspecting or observing the lesson that my dad was giving. And he was so impressed with him, thought he was a lovely young man. I think he offered him a job possibly at one of his schools. But that is how my grandfather decided that this man was right for his daughter, and a marriage was arranged. I think my father's dreams were absolutely around education and around being a lawyer, and that was his absolute aim in life. And he was able to train as a teacher, and he practiced as a teacher for many years. But he did train as a lawyer and became a lawyer. And partly I think that dream was achieved. But I think he became frustrated with the constraints of some of the systems in Pakistan, in the legal system at the time, and also maybe what was happening in the wider society. And he wanted a more liberal and fair and just kind of system for his family to grow up in. So in terms of deciding to make the journey to England, there were a few opportunities. People were being invited to come from Pakistan and India and other parts of the Commonwealth to come and sort of rebuild England after the war, really. And so they did have a couple of opportunities to think about it. And I believe that they had what was called a voucher or something like that, ready to come some months before they finally did. I think they bottled out the first time. It was such a huge decision to leave their families behind. But the second opportunity, and I think possibly the last opportunity to come, they did decide to make that journey with their 3 small children and me on the way to come and build their new life in England. So their journey to England was overland. I remember them talking about all the sort of buses across Iran and Turkey, and presumably once they got to Turkey they probably took a ferry to Spain and then came across Europe. But they were really brave, considering it was the 2 of them and 3 small children making that journey. And I remember some real hardships on the way. I remember my sister Zarina, who was a toddler at that time, having an ear infection and being in a lot of discomfort and pain, and they're in a foreign country sort of trying to catch buses between places, trying to find a chemist to, get her what she needed. But also I remember them talking about fun along the way, like the children being fascinated by snake charmers or little puppeteers and circus performers that would be on the streets as they went through Iran and Turkey and across all of these places that were new to everyone. So when my family first arrived in England, they had very little, probably some clothes and personal possessions, belongings, but very, very little. If you think they were travelling overland, it would have probably been a few suitcases at most. And they went to Watford because they had a family friend there who could look out for them when they first arrived. And that's how come I was born in Watford, even though I never really lived there. I think by the time I was 6 months old, we had moved to the market town of Buckinghamshire, which is ever so like Devizes or Trowbridge or Chippenham in Wiltshire, where I've lived for the last 23 years. But for them, we built our family life in Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, which was a market town, and it was where Dad was able to get a job as a ticket collector on the trains. He wasn't able to get work as a teacher, and certainly not as a lawyer, because his law degree wasn't accepted in England, even though being in Pakistan, the law degree would have been based on the English system, having been part of the Commonwealth for hundreds of years. But interestingly, he wasn't able to practice as a lawyer, which must have been really disappointing. So at first he collected train tickets, and they were able to stay in a small house in Park Street. And I still remember that park that we used to play in when we were little. But there is a really nice story to those early years, in that they arrived in the July of 1967, and I was born in the November of 1967. And I think within that week, Dad got his first teaching job, and that was a massive achievement for him as an immigrant teacher with a young family to actually have a job in one of his professions, and that was the beginning of his teaching career in England. So in England in the late 60s, I think they lived a very simple life. We were in a small terraced house in Aylesbury. There was no heating in it, but we were comfortable, I think. I remember those sort of small paraffin fires heating the house, which must have been pretty scary with children around, but that's what they used to keep the house warm. And there were only 2 other Asian families in Aylesbury at that time. So those 3 families, including ours, did look out for each other. But interestingly, people talk about when we were in the supermarket, people coming up to my mother because I was the baby sat in the trolley, and coming to talk to us because they hadn't seen a brown baby before, and they thought it was wonderful, and saying how lovely that baby was, and yes, it was me. But actually, they didn't seem to experience racism in those early times. They did later, but in those early times, people were more interested and fascinated. And because my parents both spoke good English, because they both taught English in Pakistan, I suppose they were able to communicate and to build friendships with neighbours and colleagues in a way that perhaps other people might have struggled with if they didn't have the language. So when we were at home growing up, we'd eat Pakistani food mostly, which was fantastic. My mum was a wonderful cook. But we also used to, I remember as I was older, sort of, 10, 12, and in my teens, we'd really mix it up. And there would be, English food that was cooked as my sisters were older and they were cooking more. Then we would have English meals. My dad loved fish and chips. And at Christmas, we would always have a roast dinner with chicken, probably halal chicken. But we would, so we were very kind of open as a family to integrating all the cultures that we were a part of, and enjoyed that in terms of food very much. But sometimes my dad would complain that the food was a bit picker, which means it was a bit bland, and he wanted to spice it up a little bit, which was quite fun, hearing him complain about that. And we would just laugh and, just see it as part of the journey of trying new things. So my parents were very sociable people, very liberal and open kinds of people. And so, as well as being friends with the two other Asian families that were there in Aylesbury when we were little, because my dad by then was a teacher and he had English colleagues, he would develop friendships with them. And I remember when I was 5 or 6, every Christmas, one of his colleagues would knit these little toy animals and put them in a sack and give them to me every Christmas, and it was such a thrill. So he'd obviously built a lot of affection between him and his colleagues, and we with our neighbours when it was Eid or a special occasion, and my mum would have cooked some beautiful Pakistani food. I remember always carrying little plates of them round to our neighbours and them being really pleased with that. And especially when we were a little bit older, we had some Polish neighbours, and so we'd always take food to them when it was special occasions, and we'd always get the plate come back and it would always have lovely Polish biscuits in it. And it was very much at that time people were wanting to share their cultures. Aylesbury, that market town, was starting to slowly become more diverse. As I say, our neighbours were Polish, and we had Italian neighbours, we had English neighbours, we had Asian neighbours, and there were a lot of dishes going up and down the street at those special times. And I look back at that really fondly. And I remember when we received a dish from somebody, my mum had this really strong sense you never give the dish back empty. I remember once somebody gave us a dish back empty and she was really shocked. That sense of hospitality and of sharing in the Asian culture was so strong in her, and she brought that to all of her friends that she worked with and she got to know in England as well. So when it was early on for my family in Aylesbury, there wasn't a mosque or a place to come to centrally to worship. And I remember two things. I remember that there was a Maulvi, a religious Islamic teacher, who would come to do Quran lessons with my siblings. I was too little, but I remember he would come maybe once a week, and they'd have these paper sort of pamphlets with Arabic writing in them, and he would teach them that how to read Arabic. And that was very kind of solemn and scary to me. He was like a really serious man with a big beard, and he was really scary to me at that time. And I remember once when it was difficult and he actually slapped one of my siblings. When my parents heard about it, they were horrified and dismissed him straight away, and probably found someone else who was less strict to do that religious teaching, as it were. And I remember sometimes on a Sunday morning, when I was old enough to remember and join in, my dad would sit us down and tell us stories from the Quran. And what was really lovely was that they were stories that people who would know Bible stories would know as well. So they were the stories of Noah and of Moses and of Abraham. So we grew up with a very strong sense that our faith, Islam, had this strong root in the shared faith of Christianity and Judaism, that they came from the same root. And I think that was also part of their understanding of being liberal, understanding that they didn't see themselves as having come from a completely separate heritage, that their heritage was rooted in a common place with these other great faith traditions. But later on in their life in Aylesbury, they were instrumental in finding a mosque place for Muslims to come together and worship, particularly special occasions like Eid. I remember my dad and my brother going to the mosque on the morning of Eid to go and worship, and maybe us as women going to a friend's house and saying prayers together there before everyone then came back together for meals and things. And I'm really proud that one of my dad's legacies in Aylesbury was actually funding and building the first purpose-built mosque in Aylesbury, which is still there and still actively used by the community. And because he was a teacher and he specialised in teaching English to children when they first arrived in the country, that was the school of which he was headmaster in the end, it meant every single family migrating to Aylesbury knew my parents because he'd literally taught their children. And now when we go back to Aylesbury and people are in their 40s and 50s, they'll come up to me with really fond memories telling me that they were taught by my parents. And that's really moving to me. I'm really, really proud of that. And they've built lives and have flourished and grown their own families in that market town in the countryside. So I know that my siblings were mad keen to go to school in England. In fact, so much so that my sister Zarina, who was probably about 2 or 3 when she arrived, she was so keen to go to school, which she was seeing my elder sister and brother doing. I think she was kind of trying to lie about her age so that she could get to go, desperate to go to school. So they absolutely loved it. They absolutely lapped it up. My eldest sister was 9 or 10 at that time, and for her it must have been a struggle because English wasn't her first language. She sat the 11 plus very soon after arriving, and that was an exam to help you choose what secondary school you ended up at. And she didn't pass. She was the only person in our family not to pass the 11 plus because of the language barrier. But she was amazing. She worked really hard in the school that she was at. She was the first Asian girl in our community to go to university. Certainly the first Asian person that we knew to go and do a PhD. And then she did a postdoctorate research period for about 2 years in Switzerland. And for her, as a young Asian woman, to do that, and for my parents to support her in doing that, to support her to go and do a postdoctorate in another country, this was unheard of in the 1980s. You know, she was a real trailblazer, and as were the rest of my family, we were the first generation to go into higher education amongst all of the community that we knew. And I hope that it was a good example for others, that was okay to do that, and that we still came home, we still respected our culture. We didn't kind of change or go into some sort of bad path by actually being given that freedom and being given that opportunity. But for my parents, you know, that was everything that their move had been about. It was about education. It was about the opportunities that they could give their children that perhaps they hadn't had in their home country. So I think it was really interesting being like one of the only Asian people in a primary school in England. I kind of didn't notice it too much when I was younger. I had friends and got along with people, and that was fine. It really hit harder towards the top of middle school and going into secondary school, where we were literally, I had one elder sister in the same secondary school as me, and then I was joining in the first year, and literally we were the only people of colour in our school. And this was the 1980s. I literally started secondary school in 1980, and as the 80s went on, there was things like the National Front, and there was more racism on the street. You know, I remember people calling me the P word as I was just like walking to school, and that was really like confusing and upsetting, because I'd had all those years and all of that background of being very integrated and really comfortable in this market town where we lived. And so that was disorientating. And I think the other thing that was a little bit hard about being the only person of colour in a white school, even though the teachers were fab, I had nice friends, I enjoyed it usually. But it was whenever something happened in the news, so there were riots happening in the 80s, or if something, difficult was happening with the Asian community elsewhere in the country, sometimes even elsewhere in the world, people would look to me as though I was kind of part of that and I was somehow responsible for that. And I found that really disappointing and really like setting me apart. And it was like I wasn't being seen as an individual who had my own interests and my own passions and my own personality. I was somehow being lumped in with this thing over which I had no control at all, no input at all. And yet somehow every time someone mentioned something from India or Pakistan, they would look over at me as though it was to do with me. And it actually wasn't at all. I was a girl from Aylesbury. That's all I'd ever known. And I had huge respect for everyone else's cultures. And I never made them responsible for it. And so now I really feel, now we're in our current day where people often misunderstand Islam, for example, or there are issues around security or terror or, really genuine things that any person would be afraid of. But to hold the rest of a community responsible for what one or two individuals do who are absolutely operating alone, and it's unbelievable that they should be lumped in any way with ordinary people who would never behave in those ways. So I think that's partly where my passion for bringing people of different cultures together and helping them to relate to what's ordinary and what's common between them. I suppose that's what I've always believed in, because I can see the damage that not understanding that can make in people's attitudes and beliefs, I suppose. So I think my parents felt a massive responsibility for representing their culture in this market town with this quite rural environment around them. They were the representatives of the culture. They were one of three families that was there. And then through my dad's work and my mum also teaching women English, they were literally bridging the gaps between people in terms of being able to communicate. So they became very involved in the Council for Racial Equality. And can I say that again? Because I fluffed that. So my dad was really involved in setting up the Council for Racial Equality in Aylesbury, my hometown, in a rural market town, and he was chair of it at some point in his life, I remember. But to him that was incredibly important because it had people from different communities represented, it had the mayor represented. It was literally the place where choices were being made about people understanding each other, about maybe having a place for worship. I know he was really involved with an interfaith group, and I've got really fond memories of going to maybe twice a year to these interfaith worship sort of services, and their dad would bring out a prayer mat and show how a namaz would be said, and then there'd be an English guy with a guitar singing a hymn, and it was all so beautiful and so inclusive, and I'm so proud that they really made those efforts to bring people together at that time. So I studied plant biochemistry at university in London, and I was based in the East End of London to do that. And one of the things I really remember in a positive way was how really diverse my cohort was. So there were about 80 people studying it, and we'd get split off into different groups for different things. But once a week for lectures, we'd all be in one place. And you always used to sit near the front because I was always late. And one of the things I remember was looking over my shoulder and just seeing a real mix, like a genuine mix of cultures there, and feeling so happy about that, and how everyone got on so well together. So this was the early 90s by this point. So things had moved on. We'd moved through that slightly scary period of the 80s, and everyone was very relaxed in that environment. So my student years were happy, and I felt very easy moving between my home life and my student life, and that was great. So after uni, I decided to try and get work in film production because I'd always had a passion for it. And I got my first job in Oxford with a production company there. And it was during my time in Oxford that I met my husband, who's called David, and who was an English person. And so that was another first that my family incorporated into their experience. I was really nervous about introducing him to them because even though my parents were really lovely and really liberal people, in many ways they were very traditional. Their faith meant an awful lot to them. They'd been arranging marriages for my older siblings, some with success and some not with success. And I think they'd expected the same for me. And so I was really scared when I introduced them to my now husband. And we had a difficult few months as they came to try and accept it, to try and understand it and understand what that would mean for our family and the pressure that they'd be put under in their community. As this was the first, it was another first. We were the first family in Aylesbury to have someone who was not an Asian enter that family. But, you know, they were such lovely people, my parents, and when they realised that we loved each other and that my husband was sincere and I was sincere, they supported us to be married. And we had 2 weddings. We had a Muslim wedding, which is in the new multicultural centre of Aylesbury, which my dad had helped to make happen. And we were one of the first events in that multicultural centre. And then a week later, we had a church wedding. And what I'm so proud of on behalf of both of our families is that both families came to both celebrations. Nobody stayed away from either celebration. And we built from that point. And sometimes it wasn't easy, but it's because we decided that we were going to make it work, that we did make it work. And it was a really beautiful thing. And they grew to love and respect my husband so much. He actually taught Islam to his students as an RE teacher, and he would talk about that with my dad, have long conversations, and my dad would say that David respects Islam more than some of his other in-laws did, and I'm so proud of that. But I'm so proud of them giving me, I would have made that marriage anyway, but it meant so much that they did it with me. And Dad always said he would never let me walk down the aisle by myself. He would never let people think that I didn't have a family who supported me. And it was such an emotional time because I know it was really hard for him. And I have always appreciated and loved him so much for being the brave one. It was him who, when my family were really angry with me for wanting to marry an English person, it was my dad who drove to where I lived in Oxford. And I remember him sitting in my kitchen in Oxford and we were both crying, and he took out a card, and it was an engagement card, and he'd written it in it all by himself, and he said, "I've heard that you've got engaged, so you should have a card." And how hard it must have been for him to make that drive, and how generous of him to do that for me, his daughter, who he loved, to support me like that, to give me that permission. It was massive. And I will always remember that and always appreciate that. So when we were growing up in England as teenagers, we were very aware that we were kind of between 2 cultures, really. So we really loved our parents. They were great lovely people, but they were quite strict. They were Muslims. Their faith was really important to them. Their values, in some ways, were very traditional. And yet we had school friends who were English. We were encouraged to join fully in, school plays and have friends and bring them over to our home and so forth. So it felt, to be honest, like we were fluid between two cultures a lot of the time. And as we got older, and maybe I might have liked to have a boyfriend, I know my older sisters would have liked that, but they felt absolutely they couldn't do that. It was a thing that they absolutely could not do. It would not have been countenanced to have a relationship like that. Even when they went to university, they were older than me, so they did it first. They might have fancied people, they might have had a boyfriend. I'm not going to comment on that, but they could absolutely not share that at home with my parents. It was something that was taboo, really. You just couldn't talk about it. And there was this pressure, because they were like the first of a community that then had grown and was very much, everyone knew them because they'd been taught by my parents. So literally he was called Master G in the community. He was Mr. Baloch, Master G, because he was the teacher. And so when we came home from uni, when we came and went, we were very aware that people were watching us to see what we had done, to know what had happened. And I remember once an old school friend, I'd graduated by this point, I was in my early 20s, and an old school friend was going to go to the cinema with me. We were going to go and literally see like a Disney film together. And my mum knew this person, and but she said he mustn't come to the front door. He can't be seen to come and knock at your door and for you to walk out together. So I had to meet him on the corner to go and watch this Disney film. He was not my boyfriend. He was never my boyfriend. But it was that kind of thing. It was that you were part of this wider community that would allow certain things, but there were other things that just could not happen. And that's why, obviously, when I was older and I did meet my husband, it was absolutely radical that I married an English person, and absolutely radical that my parents welcomed and accepted him, for which I'm so proud of them. But it's quite interesting when years later my father passed away and I met some old family friends who we would have known at that time, and they were talking about their grown-up children. And they said, oh yeah, our son's up in Leicester and his wife's English, and oh yeah, our daughter, she's married to this English man up in Nottingham or whatever. And I was just amazed, because these were very, very traditional people who were the people I was a little bit scared of when I was growing up. And I'm not taking credit for it. We happened to be the first. But what's happened over time is, as that integration has grown, of course people fall in love with each other. Of course families are made. And that brings people together in the long run. So once we were married, I remember going to a wedding in Aylesbury, maybe a year or two later, and I even remember wearing my wedding clothes, my Indian wedding clothes, because you could do that. You could wear your wedding dress going to someone else's wedding if you'd recently been married, and my husband being with me, and how lovely that was. In a way, you could talk to more people than at your own wedding. So in a way, that was kind of more where we introduced him to everyone and we could sort of celebrate again. So that was really a lovely thing. But I was still a little bit cautious. And then 5 years later, we had our first child. And I think that's where things really blossomed for my parents. Obviously, they were so excited. It was their first grandchildren. And there's a story that my husband tells. I was still in the hospital having had our first child, who was called Elliot Zahir. And that was really important to us. We chose the names really carefully for our children. We wanted them to have English names and we wanted them to have Muslim names, so that they at any point in their life could choose which ones they used, or they could use both. And so he was called Elliot Zahir, and that means gift of God and shining light. And, you know, it really means something to me and to us to have chosen those names that meant something. Anyway, Elliot Zahir had been born, and I was in the hospital with him still. And my parents were at home with David, my husband, and with his parents. And it had been an overnight delivery, so he was probably exhausted, and he was sat with them. Obviously, they were happy that their first grandchild had been born. But I remember that David broke down in tears with emotion at that, of the night he'd been through, and the fact that his wife had had a child and everything that meant. And he was crying, and I remember his parents, he says how his parents just sat at one side of the dining table just watching him, and how it was my mum who stood up and went around to him and comforted him. She put her arms around him, and that meant so much to him because she showed that affection and she showed that support when he needed it in a way that his parents couldn't understand in that moment, or they weren't demonstrating in that moment. And I think for him and them, that was like a turning point of, they'd accepted, but I think at that point they accepted in their hearts that we were part of their family, and that David and our children were part of the Baloch family and part of their heritage. And that was a really beautiful thing. So in the early 2000s, I moved to Wiltshire with my husband and our small child, Elliot. He was about 2 years old, and my husband had got a teaching job in Wiltshire. And I'd actually been working for years in Swindon at that point. So I was quite excited that at last we were living in Wiltshire and we could build our family life there. And I lived in a place that was quite near Devizes, so I was suddenly back in that market town environment that I'd grown up in and felt really comfortable in. But again, what was quite interesting was that I was again in that situation where I was one of very few Asian people who was in that environment. And to be honest, I was fine with that. I was kind of used to that. And but it was really lovely. You know, people were really just kind and welcoming and interested. I never had any racism issues at that time. And I think what I'd noticed was when we'd go out for walks as a family, whether in Devizes, whether in towns or cities, what I noticed is when they would see my husband as a white man and me as an Asian woman and our child in a pushchair or a toddler walking along, people would smile at us. People loved that we were a family of mixed heritage. They loved that. And I think it's what I taught my children when they became aware that maybe they were different in their class or different in their schools or friendship groups. I would say to them, you're so lucky you've got two cultures that you can draw on when you want to. You've got two parts of your world that are really special. And also, I told them that story about how when I noticed people looking at us and how they'd smile, it would make people happy because to them it represented something that was positive, that was good, that was accepting, that was about England moving forward. And what's quite interesting is maybe 15 years later going to IKEA in Bristol, where I'd been lots when we first got married. And I went later, in fact it was more than that, it was maybe 20 years later, and I was walking around with my husband and there were so many young couples of mixed heritage going around just like we did, choosing their IKEA things. And I remember David and I sat in the cafe feeling quite emotional, saying we were one of the first to be like us, and now it's so normal and so accepted, and here they all are in IKEA building their lives just like we built our life. And Yeah, so even though for Wiltshire it was unusual at that time, again, I've spent over 20 years in Wiltshire. I've seen more diversity grow in Wiltshire and enjoyed seeing that, and more communities flourish. But again, I was happy to be a trailblazer because that's what I was used to doing. I was used to being like the only one for a while and just getting on with it. So in terms of staying connected to my culture, I would say it was through my family very much. It was through my parents as they grew elderly, and through caring for them alongside my siblings, who really did the lion's share of the work looking after them when they were more frail. They lived closer to them, but I would visit whenever I could, and the children would come with me and my husband would come with me. So we were really connected through them. You know, we would go for Eid and we would go for family celebrations, and they would share and come to Wiltshire, you know, in our celebrations as well. But it was through them that I remained connected to the cousins and the aunties and the uncles, who some were in Pakistan and some were in America or elsewhere in the world. And it was through them that that connection was made and maintained. And when they passed away in the last few years, I had a very strong sense that the responsibility of that connection was now with myself and with my siblings, and literally those conversations, those FaceTimes, those Zoom calls, it was our job now to make sure that those happened and those loving relationships were maintained, and I'm glad to say that they have been. So in terms of thinking about why is it important to maintain a connection, I think for a few years when it was first hard and I was scared of getting married to an English person, I think I felt quite angry and I was willing to take the risk of losing that side of my culture if I had to. And what I realised as you know, I built my own family and I had maintained that loving relationship with my own parents. I realised I had that opportunity for myself, but also I owed it to my children for them to be able to access this wider family that was there, that was ready to love them and accept them, and to teach them about this other culture if they wanted to understand it. So it felt important to maintain that contact. And also, it was part of my history too. I remembered those aunties and uncles visiting when I was younger. They came to the market towns, you know, we took them to climb up Coombe Hill and took them to Aylesbury and Stonehenge and all of those places. You know, we had shared our stories, and I thought if that just stops with Nana and Nanny, my parents, if that just stops at that time, what a shame that would be. And it would be taking the choice away from my children, because if I stopped that connection, it would be broken forever. It would be so hard for my children to rediscover that. And it's part of accepting my whole self and being proud of all that I am. You know, I love that I'm a British Asian. I love that I move between cultures and that I bring cultures together through my work. It's the most important thing in my life, I think, if you had to pin it down. I'm really proud that my life has been about helping people understand each other, because I think we're all human and we have so much to share that is really positive. So I think in terms of challenges, both in the Asian community and in the British community, it's never been institutional. I've been really fortunate to work in the arts in a sector that believes in seeing people as individuals and respecting their backgrounds and their lived experience. So I haven't had to fight too hard there. I would say that has been more about daring to be in leadership positions or daring to step forward to do things when perhaps I wouldn't have naturally, and then sometimes being the only Asian person who's at a decision-making situation or representing, on boards and committees and things like that. So I've been glad to make that representation in those situations and felt the responsibility that I was the only person of colour in the room and kind of took it on. I think in terms of the wider community and representing a different point of view to perhaps a more closed Asian culture, or doing the same, representing an Asian culture to an English community that perhaps didn't understand it. I felt that responsibility quite heavily, and sometimes it was frustrating because if people were making assumptions about you just because of how you looked, and they didn't know anything about me. They didn't know that I really loved English music, or that my best friend was English, or that I was in love with an English person. They were just seeing this brown person. And the same when I was in an Asian cultural situation, I felt there were assumptions being put on me about what my aspirations should be, or what they thought I would just get married and have children, which is fine, but they had a very particular view of what that marriage would be and how I'd bring up that family. So I found it quite challenging, and in the end I just thought, you can only do this one conversation at a time. You can only live your life with the best integrity that you can and be as honest as you can when people are interested and ask about it. You can't kind of go waving a banner about it. And in the end, I feel it was just, can you imagine when I just turn up with my husband and my mixed race children to a cultural event, or I turn up at a work meeting and I'm the Asian woman and I happen to be the chief exec of Create, and I don't need to write a speech about that, because just by being there and being me and having those responsibilities, it kind of tells the story of that family that chose to come here, that family that chose to integrate, that family that believed in education. That story is implicit in who I am, and I'm so proud of that. And I'm not proud for myself, I'm proud for everyone who enabled that to happen. I know I stand on the shoulders of my family who made those choices. I didn't make my beautiful story by myself. They made that story in the choices that they made and in enabling me to be who I am. So my parents first came to England in 1967, in the July of 1967, and my dad was from an area of Pakistan called Leia, which is quite a rural area, and he adopted the surname Baloch, which is linked to Balochistan, which is an area in Pakistan that still exists. And so his name was Ghulam Sarwar Khan Baloch, and I always remember seeing the letters addressed to him were always GSK Baloch. It was a real a great long name, but my mum always used to call him Sarwar, which is one of his middle names, and it's also my middle name, so she would call him Sarwarji, which is like a polite or loving way to say his name. And my mother was one of 6 daughters and 6 sons, and she was towards the younger of that family. And her name was Shamim, and her surname was Mufti, so she was Shamim Mufti. And I understand that Mufti is a name that comes from like a really long line of kind of wise advisors, so they'd have probably been like a political class or an education class, and my granddad was indeed a school teacher and a school inspector. So they came from both quite different worlds, and it was the fact that my dad trained to become a teacher that actually did bring them together. And when they got married in, I think it was 1957.